O God, do not keep silence. Do not hold your peace or be still, O God. For behold, your enemies make an uproar. Those who hate you have raised their heads. They lay crafty plans against your people. They consult together against your treasured ones. They say, come, let us wipe them out as a nation. Let the name of Israel be remembered no more. For they conspire with one accord. Against you they make a covenant. The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagrites, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre. Ashur has also joined them. They are the strong arm of the children of Lot. Thus saith the Lord.
We're going to deal with our second topic on the Arab states and prophecy. We shall spend most of our time in the first two divisions on the root of the conflict, which begins with Ishmael, followed by Esau. And then secondly, we'll deal with the perpetual hatred or animosity of the Arab peoples towards the Jews. And then we'll begin to summarize, because it's too extensive to cover in one session, on the future of the different Arab states. And we shall deal with them individually because they don't have all the same prophecies or the same futures as other prophecies give. Genesis chapter 12, we begin with the Jewish history in chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3, beginning with Abram, ultimately running through Isaac and then through Jacob and the 12 sons of Jacob that in turn fall to the 12 tribes of Israel. So Jewish history begins in chapter 12, verses 1 through 9, but Arab history actually begins in chapter 12, verses 10 through 20. So looking at verse 10, and there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was sore in the land. And it came to pass, when he was come near to enter into Egypt, he said unto Sarai his wife, Behold, now I know that you are a beautiful woman to look upon, and it will come to pass when the Egyptians shall see you, and they will say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, and they will save you alive. Say, I pray you, that you are my sister, that may be well with me for your sake, and that my soul may live because of you. And it came to pass that when Abram was come into Egypt, the Egyptians beheld the woman that she was very beautiful, and the princes of Pharaoh saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Now in these first few verses of the second part of chapter 12, we have the actual origins of the Arab peoples. Abram comes into the land of Canaan, and then because of a famine, he feels he must sojourn to survive into the land of Egypt. In order to avoid any problems with his wife, he passed his wife off as his sister and not as his wife. Now she was his half-sister. They had the same father but not the same mothers. So she was his half-sister, but it was to hide the fact that she was also his wife in order to be able to stay alive as they entered into the Egyptian families and things of that nature. And indeed, it begins to work past Sarai, how beautiful Abram's wife is at this stage, Sarai, later to be Sarah. And so, in verse 16, notice, as a result of being his wife taken into Pharaoh's harem, as part of the wife, they received a woman called Hagar, in verse 16. He dealt well with Abram for his sake. He had sheep and oxen and male asses and maidservants and she-asses and camels. And so they received in the sojourn to Egypt into the land of Egypt, the land of Canaan. And among the women they received was the one in particular that will play a major role, beginning a bit later in chapter 16, and her name was Hagar or Hagar. And later on, the Pharaoh discovered what the truth was, and he scolded Abram for passing this wife as off only his sister, which was half true anyway. She was his half-sister, but his purpose was to hide the identity of she, the half-sister, also being Abram's wife. And so as a result, Pharaoh then expelled the family to go back in the land of Canaan. However, he did not take away all of the wealth he gave to Abram in verse 16. As a result, Abram left. Already he came into Egypt as a wealthy man. He became even more wealthy with so much more wealth as he went back to the land of Canaan. And so in chapter 13, we move from the Egyptian context to the land of Canaan context. Let's go over to chapter 16. In chapter 16, you have another folly. In chapter 12 was Abram's folly, but now it is Sarah's folly in chapter 16, verses 1 through 6. Now, in chapter 12, God already promised Abram that he will have a son. That was a divine promise. However, didn't rely on, at least with the case of Sarai at this point, she didn't rely on God alone. She relied on her own tactics. So in verses 1 through 6 of chapter 16, she began to deal with one of the female servants or female slaves in the household of Abram that was received in the sojourn to the land of Egypt. And what Sarai was now doing was, because she felt she could not get pregnant, to pass off one of her handmaids, Hagar or Hagar, to Abram to sire a son. There's no need to do this because God already made a promise back in chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. Eventually Abram will have the line of a son who would be Isaac. But between chapter 12 and chapter 16, 10 years have passed, and so far no child has come forth. And so they decided now to pass the handmaid over to Abram. He had a relationship with Abram. As a result, she got pregnant, and the result was a son who ended up being a son called Ishmael. So skip down to verse 7. And the angel of Jehovah found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way of Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's handmaid, whence come you, and whither are you going? And she said, I am fleeing from the face of my mistress Sarai. Now when Sarai at this point still did not have a child, now it was the handmaid, Hagar, that did conceive. And that created another rather fearful fight in the family structure. At this point, Sarah still had no child, but then she gave to Abram Hagar to have a son through her. And when Hagar got pregnant, that became another point of conflict. So finally, the conflict was so severe that Hagar had to flee the household of Abram in verse 7 and 8, and then she's confronted by an individual that becomes prominent in the books of Genesis and on. In verse 7, the angel of Yahweh, the angel of Jehovah. This is never a common, ordinary angel. This is the second person who takes visible form, and that is the second person of the triune God. And he instructs her now to go back and submit to the authority not only to Abram but also to Sarai. And then skip down to verse 12 and notice the kind of child that she will give birth to. They'll have long-term circumstances. Notice 4 things in verse 12. Number 1, you shall be as a wild donkey among men. That he'll be characterized as a wanderer in the desert territories of the Negev and the desert territories of the Sinai. But he will be one that will emphasize wandering different parts of the desert and develop his own tribe. Secondly, his hand shall be against every man, and as the people now are part of Ishmael, that are now wandering in the deserts, they'll come in contact with other people groups, and there'll be the tendency to attack these other people groups. Then thirdly, and every man's hand shall be against him. And because of the attack nature of the descendants of Ishmael, there will be a counterattack by those that have been attacked in order for their own self-defense. And then fourthly, he shall dwell over against all his brethren. And the Hebrew terminology for over against means they'll live side by side. Descendants of Isaac, the descendants of Ishmael will live in side by side. But secondly, it has the meaning of side by side with an attitude of military, an attitude of anti-this and anti-that. And so this constant element will be every man against him, and he shall dwell over against all his brothers. There will be a continual animosity between the Arab people coming from Ishmael and the Jewish people coming from Isaac. And that is a conflict that's continued to this very day. Anyway, eventually the household of the family of Hagar and Ishmael are expelled from the house of Abram, and now they begin to wander in the deserts, was already prophesied by the angel in chapter 14. And so Ishmael, look at now to chapter 21, by this point of time, Ishmael is at least 5 or 6 years older than Isaac. And we tend to give birthday parties to our children in our traditions here, but in those days they were not yearly traditions, but there were special traditions at different points of development. So in verse 8, notice, and the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. And one of these special celebrations is the official day of the weaning of the child. And in those days, a child was weaned between the ages of 3 up to 5 years old. And that would be Isaac now was being weaned. It was a special time of celebration, but there was one spoiler. In verse 9 we read, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had born unto Abraham, mocking. You don't see it in English, but the root meaning of the Hebrew words is the same root. The name of Ishmael and the word for mocking is the same root in the Hebrew text. And you see it if you ever take Hebrew 101. But this is what happens here. And that goes beyond the point of no return. And then what Abram does is he expels Hagar and the son, Ishmael. And they are now to begin what God said the family would be, wandering. As they grow in tribal numbers, there'll be a wandering tribe, sometimes 12 different tribes develop from this one unit, as we know from the book of Genesis. And we have the wandering tribes, and we have the Jewish tribe, always in the context of animosity and other problems. And when they were expelled, Ishmael received a wife from Egypt. And the Egyptians, who at the present time are Semitic, the original Egyptians were not of the Semitic line, but they were of a different line. And they were also anti against Semitic groups like the Jewish people. As we come to chapter 25 of Genesis, we come to the second key person involved in this relationship, and that is Esau. And Esau was the firstborn son of twins, but as we know from Genesis 25, verses 27 through 34, Genesis 25, verses 27 through 34, that Esau despised his birthright. Esau could care less about the meaning of his birthright. He wanted the physical benefits, but he could care less about the spiritual benefits of being in the firstborn line. So as we read in chapter 25 of Genesis, verses 27 through 34, Genesis 25, verses 27 through 34, Esau despised his birthright. Look at chapter 25 for now and notice in verse 27. And the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a quiet man, this is the ASV, dwelling in tents. But the good thing about not the NASB, but the ASV, is that if they use a translation that does not reflect the Hebrew word, they put on the sideline. And the sideline of this ASV Bible, it points out the actual Hebrew word means perfect. So the Hebrew doesn't say that Isaac was a quiet man. What does that mean, being quiet? He never said anything. But the word quiet is the wrong translation. The correct translation on the side margin is, he was a perfect man, which does not mean stillness, but he lived in accordance with the will of God, and there was always a sacrifice he could offer when he fell into some form of disobedience or some form of sin. So verse 28, now Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, and Rebekah loved Jacob. What we learned about Isaac is mostly a physical issue. He loved the way his son would grow up to give venison, kill the deer, cook the venison, and bring the venison to dinner. But the wife Rebekah had a more spiritual standards, and she loved Jacob for spiritual reasons. And one day Esau came back from hunting, but he caught nothing, and he was rather hungry. He asked for some of the lentil soup that Jacob happened to be cooking, but Jacob says, "Sell me first your birthright." And so he's willing to sell his birthright because for Esau it was totally meaningless. So notice what it says in verse 34, chapter 25, verse 34. And Jacob cooked. Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink and rose up, and notice the last two phrases, and he went his way. So Esau despised his birthright. That's the biblical demand. This is the biblical decree. Esau despised his birthright. He could care less about the physical elements, of the spiritual elements. He wants the physical elements. It would make him richer. We could care less about the spiritual issues. But ultimately in chapter 26, Jacob got the patriarchal blessing, and once the patriarchal blessing has been decreed, it stays there. So look at chapter 27 and look at verse 41. 27, verse 41. And Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, "The days of mourning for my father are at hand, and I will slay my brother Jacob." So because he lost out on the patriarchal blessing, and Isaac was tricked into giving it, the principles of those days, once a person provides a patriarchal blessing, even if he was tricked to do so, then there's nothing more to change it. So now Jacob did receive the patriarchal blessing. Esau could care less about the spiritual benefits, but he cares a lot about the physical benefits, which will now end up going to Jacob. And so in verse 41, Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing where his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, "The days of mourning for my father are at hand. I will then slay my brother Jacob." So again, Jacob wants the spiritual benefits. Esau could care less about the spiritual benefits, but he wants the physical benefits. So now Jacob is told by his parents to leave the household, go back to the land of Aram or Aramea. That is where the family under Abraham originally came from, and stay with them until Esau's anger subsides. Now Jacob is accused of stealing the patriarchal blessing, but Esau did not steal the blessing, because the blessing goes to the one who receives the firstborn rights, and that is now given to Jacob because he purchased the right of the firstborn when he gave him a bowl of lentil soup. And so this animosity continues for centuries. For example, look at the book of Numbers. In Numbers chapter 20, verses 14 to 21, Numbers 20, 14 to 21 is the section where Israel has now ended 38 years of wilderness wanderings. And now the best way of getting to the promised land is to go through the land of Edom. And so twice, Moses writes a letter to the king of the Edomites to be allowed to pass through their territory, and they'll stay on the road. If they transgress, then they will clearly give them the payment. So look at verse 14. And Moses sent messengers from Kadesh unto the king of Edom, and Edom was the twin brother of Jacob. Thus says your brother Israel, you know all the travail that's befallen us. And also he points out that the people of Edomites have kept record of Jewish history. They knew about the Jewish migration to Egypt. They knew about the 4 centuries of dwelling there, and a portion of about 215 years of enslaving them there, and so on. And therefore, you would think that the Edomites would have some passion, but they had no passion. And they would not let Israel pass through their territory. And that forced Moses to go a long way, about 200 miles south, make a U-turn, and about 200 miles north, with an extra 100 miles to finally reach the borders of the east side of the Jordan River. So as you read the book of Judges, you read of Ishmaelites and Edomites and other groups attacking Israel. Now turn to Psalm 83. Psalm 83. Psalm 83 brings the situation just about to where we are today. Psalm 83 verse 1, O God, keep not you silent, hold not your peace, be not still, O God, for lo, your enemies make a tumult, and they that hate you have lifted up the head. They take crafty counsel against your people, and consult together against your hidden ones. They have said, come, let us cut them off from being a nation. The name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. For they have consulted together with one consent against you that make a covenant. And then in verses 6, 7, 8, he combines the different nations which today make up the Arab peoples as coming together to make sure that Israel never survives continuity within the territory of the land of Israel. So in Psalm 83, verses 1 through 8, the goal was spelled out, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may no longer be in remembrance. That has been true of the policy in 1947, 1948. There's been some measures of peace with some of the Arab states. Still, the other Arab states still follow the goal to annihilate Israel, so Israel will cease to be remembered as having any rights to the territory of the Promised Land. Now turn to Ezekiel chapter 35. In Ezekiel chapter 35, he focuses on one country, the land of Edom, which was, again, Edom was the twin brother of Jacob. But emphasizes the fact that since all of these centuries, there's this continuity of what I would call perpetual enmity. Verse 1 of chapter 35, moreover, the word of Jehovah came unto me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Mount Seir, and prophesy against it, and say unto it, thus says the Lord Jehovah, behold, I am against you on Mount Seir, and I will stretch out my hand against you. I will make you a desolation and astonishment. I will lay your cities waste, and you shall be desolate, and you shall know that I am Jehovah. And notice in verse 5, because you have had a perpetual enmity, it has given over the children of Israel to the powers of the sword in the time of their calamity, in the time of the iniquity of the end. So notice this perpetual animosity has continued not merely for decades, but literally at this point for centuries. And it continues still to this very day. You can mark down Obadiah. I don't remember what chapter it's in, but it's in verses 10 through 14 in one of the chapters of Obadiah, that they helped the enemies of Israel, and they blacked out Jewish people fleeing from the invasions. And the Edomites, who were supposed to be sympathetic as a half-brother nation and twin-brother nation, that they would not continue providing any help for them. And so in this other section in your outline, in the second segment, the emphasis, as you see here in verse 35, verse 5, continual affliction, continual animosity, a perpetual enmity. So let's now turn to the future of the different Arab states, because God does not have the same future for each of the Arab states. Now, these were all different countries, and the main language, except for Egypt, was the language of the Aramaic language. But in the invasions that occurred from the Arab conquests in the 6th century in particular and onward, that the languages were removed, and the people that were conquered were intermarried with the ruling populations and the conquering populations. And their language began to be Arabic, which has been the main language to this day. As well as usually was the discontinuity of the Aramaic language and changed over to the Arabic language to this day. So dealing with the Arab states, which is now mostly Arabic because of the Arabs' invasion of the 5th and 6th centuries, that eventually peace will come between Israel and the Arab states in one of three ways, either by means of destruction, or by means of occupation, or by means of conversion. These are three different ways it will happen: by means of destruction, by means of occupation, and by means of conversion. And dealing with Bible prophecy, we can deal with specific nations. So let's pick up with Lebanon. And the passage with Lebanon is from Ezekiel chapter 47, verse 13, to chapter 48, verse 29. I repeat, Ezekiel 47, verse 13 to chapter 48 and verse 29. The peace would come between Israel and Lebanon by means of occupation, because what we now call Lebanon was always part of the Promised Land. It was also that part of the Promised Land that Jewish people never had the privilege to actually have joy over. In biblical times, nor in our modern history, has Israel ever taken so much of the Promised Land. Ultimately, by the time the kingdom is established, what is now called Lebanon will be part of Israel, and that'll be the actual final borders of Israel that were never fulfilled in biblical history. Let's go to the country of Jordan. And modern-day Jordan covers three ancient territories. And going from south to north, you have Edom, followed by Moab, followed by Ammon. Now these three countries, Edom, Moab, and Ammon, used to be Aramaic-speaking countries, but they were overrun by the Arab conquest, intermarried with the Arab population, and they no longer speak Aramaic, they now speak Arabic. So the one that receives the most information is Edom, and again, Edom is the twin brother of Jacob. As we saw in chapter 35 of Ezekiel, they focus on it being guilty of perpetual enmity, also perpetual desolation in verses 14 through 16. Isaiah 34, verses 8 through 15, Isaiah 34, 8 through 15, it's a land of perpetual desolation. As Jeremiah 49, 7 and 18, Jeremiah 49, verses 7 and 18, the land of perpetual astonishment. In the book of Obadiah, verses 17 to 21, it ultimately will become Israel's possession. And finally, Ezekiel chapter 25, verses 12 to 14, Ezekiel 25, 12 to 14, initially it'll be destroyed by a war with Israel. And after God uses Israel to destroy much of the land of Edom, God will then rain fire and brimstone upon the land of Edom, now southern Jordan, and the land will be perpetual burning, and there'll be perpetual smoke arising for the whole 1,000-year kingdom as it suffers the destruction by God directly. Central Jordan is the ancient land of Moab. And in Jeremiah chapter 48, verse 47, Jeremiah 48, 47, it will initially suffer a destruction, but not as total as southern Jordan, not as total as Edom. And those who survive will undergo a national salvation. And there will be a land called Edom in the Messianic kingdom. So Edom will be totally destroyed. Moab suffered destruction but undergoes a national salvation. And the northern section, which is the Ammonite section, in Jeremiah 49 verses 1 through 6, Jeremiah 49 verses 1 through 6, they'll suffer initial destruction, but also followed by a national conversion. And again, these were all Aramaic-speaking languages, but became Arabic-speaking because of the Arab conquest. Moving down to Egypt in Isaiah chapter 19, verses 1 through 22, Jeremiah 19, verses 1 through 22, initially suffer a destruction followed by a national conversion. So in chapter 19, verses 1 through 10, you see the details of how God will punish the land of Egypt. In verses 11 through 15, God will lead the leaders of Egypt astray. Furthermore, in verse 18, ultimately 5 different cities within the territory of Egypt will be speaking the language of Hebrew. Just not happened yet, but ultimately it's going to happen. What is now spoken Arabic will be changed over to Hebrew. Then in chapter 19, verses 19 to 22, there'll be a national salvation of Egypt, and Egypt shall know the Lord. In Ezekiel chapter 29, verses 8 through 14, Ezekiel 29, verses 8 through 14, the desolation of Egypt will be for the first 40 years of the Messianic kingdom. It'll be desolate with no human inhabitants, but after 40 years of emptiness, God will gather the Egyptian population and they'll populate Egypt again. And every year from then on, they will come to observe the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, in the Messianic kingdom. And so there will be a change for the last 960 years of the Messianic kingdom as far as Egypt is concerned. The next country combining Syria and Iraq, Syria and Iraq will undergo a peace by means of conversion. This is Isaiah chapter 19, verses 23 to 25. Isaiah 19, verses 23 to 25. Verse 23 points out there'll be an economic unity between Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. But in verse 24 and 25, there'll also be a religious unity, a spiritual unity with Israel in the living in the Messianic kingdom. Now we go to Saudi Arabia, Jeremiah 49 verses 28 to verse 33. Saudi Arabia will undergo a massive destruction, and we know the destruction will be total, according to verse 33. It won't have the punishment of burning brimstone. It'll just be totally depopulated, not of animals, but of humans. Ultimately, it'll be punished by destruction. And the last country is Iran. In Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 34 through 39, Jeremiah 49, verses 34 through 39, Iran, by the way, is not an Arab country, it's a Persian country. And their language is not Arabic. They speak their own Iranian tongue. So in verse 34, they're identified with the Persian ethnic identity. They'll suffer a destruction which will be partial in verses 35 to 38, and those who survive undergo a national salvation in chapter 49 to verse 39. 49 to verse 39. There's a mixture here of bad news, but also good news. Some Arab states are totally destroyed. Some Arab states only suffer a partial destruction. But they who suffer a partial destruction also undergo a national salvation. And so, for the Arab states, we can take pleasure in not in their destruction, but in the fact that sections of the Arab world will undergo national salvation. So the kingdom is established, there'll be a spiritual union between the Arab population and the Jewish population of the Messianic kingdom. And so ultimately, the spiritual world will do the winning. So that's our study for today. We'll have our closing song, and then we'll go into the benediction.